We're asking questions like, the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation. If we move away from our Christian foundations, we're not going to have a country anymore. Like they're not fuzzy questions. They are really questions about Christian dominion and control.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
For inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, and then later on in the pod, we're going to sit down with Robert P. Jones. Robert is the founder and president of Public Religion Research Institute, and we're going to talk to Robert about some of the recent surveys that have been released by PRRI, as well as the upcoming presidential election. But before we begin the pod today, Missy and I want to take time to just pause and remember those who are suffering in North Carolina this week. The images coming out of Asheville are absolutely heartbreaking, and we just want to take time and pause and think about those people who are suffering and wish them encouragement. But even more so, we want to inspire you to find a local disaster relief organization and please support it. Our brothers and sisters and friends in Asheville are really hurting right now and could use our help. So let's come together and let's help our fellow human beings there in Asheville. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I think I'm better.
Okay, a little positivity that kind of took me aback for a second. So why are you doing better?
I have an announcement to make.
You're not pregnant.
Grief. I don't know that would be better.
What is your announcement?
We have floors.
We have floors.
I mean, okay, so I feel like I need to recap for our listeners. If you are a devoted regular listener, which I'm sure you all are, you
positive.
may recall in the spring we kind of brought you in on our saga of buying an almost 100-year-old house because we thought we could HGTV this thing.
Okay, I want to stop there for just a second. I know you got a great story to talk about, but think about that. Guess whose birthday it was this week? Who turned 100 years old?
Jimmy Carter.
Our house is almost as old as Jimmy Carter.
Almost. Okay. So
happy birthday, President Carter.
That's a stretch there, preacher, but kudos to you for figuring out a way to work that in. So in the spring, we were sharing with the listeners some of the saga that happened with this house, and then we sort of stopped talking about it, because in many ways, I just absolutely couldn't anymore. I couldn't see an end in sight. It just, news kept getting worse and worse and worse. I'm still currently waiting for another shoe to drop.
After moles, cats, and frogs, it was looking bleak.
And skunks. I mean, you forget the skunk a couple of weeks ago that I had to come chase away, but that's a story for another day. In any case, I'm giving an update because I want in a world right now where we've just had a lot of stress and bad news and things, I really want to tell this human interest story that just will make your heart warm a little bit. So if you haven't been a regular listener, we, back in April, May, June, introduced you to a character in our neighborhood, Cat. Cat is a black cat, literally named Cat. And Kat belongs to a sweet neighbor across the street who we will call from henceforth. What should we call her? I'm thinking Ethel.
I like Ethel.
Ethel works? Okay, so we'll call her Ethel. So Kat belongs to Ethel, but Kat had been making some appearances in our house. Literally inside of our house. We would
open
walk
the door.
in the door.
Meow. Hello there, Cat.
And Cat is inside the house. Because we have an old house and we're doing a bunch of work, there were many holes. Mm-hmm. There's any number of ways Cat was getting in. But it would always freak me out a little bit. And I was speaking to the Lord about whether this was an omen or what do you call it if it's not a bad omen?
Premonition? No, not premonition.
A promise? I don't know.
Okay.
Anyways, Anywho, I was trying to decide if a cat is solid black, you guys. So I was trying to decide if cat is like a good omen or a bad omen. And there were days where it was undecided. Anywho, so cat has just, he's kind of a friend to all of us around here. Well, a few days ago, another neighbor was over and I was showing her the progress we've made on the house because, I'm getting the phase of life I hate the most, which is hopeful. I'm finding
not one of your favorite feelings.
No, I'm finding myself a little bit hopeful. So another neighbor came over to see the progress, and her little son came over, and we walked through the front of the house out to the backyard, and Cat just pretty much stalked us. Cat was in the front yard meowing, meowing, meowing. We went to the backyard, and Cat then went around to the side of our house, jumped the fence to come over and was meowing, meowing. Very uncharacteristic of Cat. And so I was like, that's strange.
Right.
Again, is this an omen? Are you trying to give me a warning?
Hashtag cursed or hashtag blessed.
Right. Right. So anyways, that happened and we thought, okay, that's strange. Well, a few days later, we found out our sweet neighbor, Ethel, had gone to bed and ended up sleepwalking in the middle of the night outside to a neighbor's yard.
Yeah.
In the middle of the night.
Scary stuff.
Very scary. Ended up with a broken hip. So this had happened a few days before the incident that I had with Kat. Anyways,
as she was laying there in the middle of the night. Okay, sorry.
I'm
so sorry.
Totally spoil the ending of my story.
I didn't think you were going there. Go ahead. Sorry.
So as Ethel was laying in a yard, again, in the middle of the night, nobody knew. Kat laid with her all night long.
Way to go, Kat.
And stayed with her until somebody found her. And tears to my eyes. So I'm like, how could this cat be ever a bad omen? So I'm trying to take this as a good sign that Kat is a devoted and loyal friend. And what a sweet, sweet pet story. I didn't think cats were capable of such things. I have to admit, we're not generally cat people. But Kat stayed with Ethel through the night until help arrived. And I'm so thrilled to report, as of today, you don't even know, Ethel is back home.
Oh, that's great news.
And she's recovering. And I didn't want to tell her story until I knew that, it had come to not a conclusion. She's still rehabilitating. But anyways, Ethel is back home. And we are continuing, to complete our home renovations. We'll hopefully be able
perfect. Yeah,
to live here soon. But I just, kudos to Kat.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense for today because this morning Kat met me, as I drove up and obviously has that distinct meow that he's always delivering and welcoming us. But then this afternoon, he's not been around. So
right. So Ethel's back home. But what our neighbor and I decided, and when we talked later, is Kat was clearly trying to tell us something. Something was up. I mean, again, this was during the time that Ethel was in the hospital. My situation happened, and so I think Kat was just looking. I mean, Kat's person was missing. Was not home, and I think Kat was stressed about it and was trying to let us know that he was stressed. But our neighbor who was there when Ethel arrived home said that Kat was so excited when Ethel came home and just meowed and meowed. And anyways, it's just, hopefully Kat will become just a recurring character because clearly Kat is actually the Holy Spirit somehow. I don't know.
Oh, that's fantastic.
But anyway, so there's your human interest story of the week.
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of black cats, Missy, it is the season of not only black cats, but scarecrows and witches.
Yes, some would call that my season.
I would not say that, but some might say that.
Sure, you wouldn't. Yes, it is officially October. It is my favorite month of the year. I love the smell. I love the coolness to the air. And I will even take all the sneezing that comes along with it. I'm fine. It's a trade. But yes, this is my favorite time of the year. I'm so excited to celebrate Halloween, hopefully in our new little house.
Yeah. I mean, years ago, you would get so excited for October because you called that hoodie season. And you could start wearing a hoodie officially in October.
Yeah. I still love them, but I kind of feel like I'm too old for them now. I don't know.
Well, now it's kind of like flannel season for you.
Yes. I've moved into my flannel era. hang on. I've moved into my flannel era, but yes, this is the month where I love to celebrate the cultural phenomenon that is all things fall and Halloween. There's pumpkin spice, like you said. There's witches, there's cats, there's scarecrows, all of the things. There's mums, plants, everything. I love it all. And part of what I love about this month is getting angry all over again at the church for how they've ruined this holiday for so many kids.
Well, I know that is a favorite emotion of yours. Both of us grew up in evangelical churches, and I can remember every October the same scenario playing out over and over again there at exciting Eastwood Baptist Church in East Tulsa, Oklahoma, that my Sunday school teachers and youth ministers would roll out all things evil when it came to Halloween. And it was just this barrage of evilness that just really irked me because I loved Halloween.
It's so crazy. And so, yes, a couple of days ago, I saw my first in a Facebook group, because those are the healthiest places to hang out, right?
Why do you hang out there?
Because it just fuels my hate fire. I love it. So, yes, someone posted that they've stepped away from the whole Halloween celebration and dressing up. What are some other fun things you do that day instead that incorporate God and traditions? I'm like, people, this is why folks are leaving the church in droves. So, of course, you get the norm. I mean, people are like, oh, well, my church did this great thing where we dressed up as Bible characters. And I'm like, would you go raid the costume room for all the robes and fabric, strip belts? I mean,
I know. Well, in fact, I don't know if you remember this. Early on in my career, we had a church, a couple of individuals in the church that approached me as the pastor and said, hey, we want to do this fall festival and have all of the children dress up in biblical characters. And I said, okay, but do you mean all biblical characters?
Right. You can really take some creative license with that.
Exactly.
Yes. And we were in churches that did fall festivals, not on Halloween, but we did it as part of a fall celebration, and kids dressed up in their actual Superman and, Spider-Man costumes.
Yeah.
But so we just love all of it. So let's celebrate everywhere. Let the kids dress up in a costume and go get some candy. I mean, if nothing else, it's a way to meet your neighbors that we don't talk to anymore.
Exactly.
But I was thinking about that as we met someone this past weekend, actually, who did not grow up in a home that had any faith tradition, and went with a friend to a church on a Wednesday night. He was 10 years old at about this time of year, and he was talking about them showing a film that showed kids burning in hell.
Oh, my gosh, no.
I know. Did you not hear this story? So I just thought, oh, my gosh. That is terrible.
Wow,
so
the production value alone.
I know. So he said he was 10 and he said, I got up and left. He said, I walked home like 2 miles. Like, good for you.
No kidding.
But anyways, I was thinking about how, culturally Halloween, it is, people love horror movies and haunted houses and things like that. But I was thinking, okay, when you're of an age to, if people like that, I don't. I hate to be scared. It's pretend. You know what you're getting into. You're going to this movie to be scared. Some people love that feeling. Right. I don't get it.
Yeah.
But I'm like, here's what the church did. They thought, you know what? We've got a better idea. We're going to create something similar called a hell house. Only it's not pretend. We're going to sell it as real. So instead of just letting people have a holiday where we kind of pretend and have fun, with horror movies or whatever, we're going to take it and try to convince people that this is actual real stuff that happens in your life if you don't turn away and come to our church or, get saved or baptized or whatever. I'm sorry, I'm working this out in real time, but how messed up is that?
That was so messed up. In fact, I think we could probably do an entire episode on the trauma of hell houses because it was so poignant and so just vivid, the imagery that they used, and so disgusting. It was so disgusting in the manipulation of those hell houses. So, But yes, it is October, Missy. All things, for us at least, good because the weather's changing. One of our favorite seasons, you get to pull out your flannel, and hopefully Kat will come back around.
Yes, we are looking forward to celebrating Cat's season with
That's right.
with him. So.
Yeah, so cat's always a good omen. So, well, we sat down with Robert P. Jones this week, who is the founder president of Public Religion Research Institute this week, and just had a great conversation with him about some surveys that PRRI has just released, as well as the upcoming election.
Yes, like many of our guests, I really do not feel intellectually qualified to have a conversation
just fine.
with Robbie. Great. But he is brilliant, and the work that they're doing is so important. It is, referred to in every, circle and space that we're in. So we're really excited to be able to have this conversation today.
Stay tuned.
I'm Reverend Starlette Thomas, director of the Raceless Gospel Initiative at Good Faith Media and host of the Raceless Gospel podcast. It's season 5, and we are giving you a love offering, an audio audit of the North American Church's messages about giving. A love offering. Join me, Reverend Starlette Thomas, your podcast pastor for season 5 of the Raceless Gospel podcast. Our 7 episodes will drop weekly on Wednesdays, beginning September 4th. Subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts and learn more at goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us. Robert P. Jones is the president and founder of Public Religion Research Institute. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, as well as White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. And he's also the author of The End of White Christian America. We asked Robert to join us today to discuss the recent reports from PRRI, as well as the upcoming election. You can read more from Robert on his Substack and at goodfaithmedia.org. Robert, welcome back to Good Faith Weekly.
Hey, thanks so much. I'm glad to be back.
Well, we are really excited that you're here. Lots going on in the news. I don't know if you've heard not.
Really?
I don't know if you've heard or not, Robbie, but there's a little election coming up in a few weeks. So, the very fate of democracy may be hanging in the balance, but no big deal.
You're gonna fix it for us, though, right?
Right. Well, I'll at least tell you how bad it is.
This is why we're friends, Robbie. This is the place I like to exist in. Is how bad it is.
That's exactly right. I'm the optimist of this partnership, and she is the Eeyore of this partnership.
I'm the realist, but go on with your question.
All right. Well, Robbie, PRI just released a report this last month interviewing 5,000 Americans demonstrating the connections between authoritarianism and Christian nationalism here in America. So, Robert, from that report, what were some of the overarching truths that you learned?
Yeah, well, as you know, we at PRRI have been studying Christian nationalism for years now, and it's sort of on a parallel track is authoritarianism, and we wanted to make sure that we had measure that. We wanted a survey that could measure that separately, so authoritarian tendencies, and then actually connect it to and see what the connections were between Christian nationalist views and authoritarian views. That's really what this last survey was up to here. We released it in New York at a Religion News Service symposium and had Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who wrote the book Strong Man, on the panel to kind of talk about these connections. But basically we found about 4 in 10 Americans tend to score high on what we call a kind of authoritarianism scale there, and we kind of ranked it very high, mixed, low, very low. So we had kind of 5 categories there, and about 4 in 10 Americans scored high on these top 2 categories. And we measured it in 2 different ways. So the first way we measured it was really a more political way, and actually, it was interesting. This way of measuring authoritarianism actually goes back to a set of scholarly work that began as a result of fascism and the rise of Nazi Germany in World War II. So it was after World War II where people were thinking, well, how did this happen, right? Mussolini and Italy, Hitler and Germany what should we understand about the nature of authoritarianism, and so we can kind of identify it. And so we built kind of our scales out of that literature. So I'll just give you a set of flavor real quickly. So it was questions like this. The only way our country can get back through the crisis ahead is to get back to our traditional values, put some tough leaders in power, and silence the troublemakers spreading bad ideas. Or what our country really needs is a strong, determined leader who will crush evil and take us back to our true path. So these are the kind of questions that people long studying authoritarianism, not just here in the U.S., but worldwide, have identified, as traits of people who believe these kinds of things are apt to support authoritarian rulers. And we built all those into a scale. And when we did, there's 4 questions that we used like that. And again, we found about 4 in 10 Americans score either high or very high on that scale. About 20% score mixed, and then just under 4 in 10 score low or very low.
Okay, so Robbie, I'm going to ask you a chicken and egg question. Now, we spoke in Syracuse, New York earlier this year at a conference talking about the rise of the doctrine of discovery and how all that began. And you did a great job explaining it in your book that while 1492 is burned in our memories, it's really 1493 that changes the trajectory of everything across Europe and here in North America. So the chicken and egg question is this. We have been talking, and PRRI and you and Good Faith Media and so many other of our great partners have been trying to counter Christian nationalism. But it seems as though as we have been talking about Christian nationalism, we're hearing more and more and using the language of authoritarianism, fascism, dictatorships. Is authoritarianism, fascism, do those come first, or does it start with Christian nationalism, or are they just always hand in hand together? Because it really does. I mean, I hate to say this, but it seems as though we've used that term so often over the last 3 or 4 years that it's lost its potency in the culture. But we're starting to talk more about how Christian nationalism is being used by authoritarianism to achieve its means. Some of us have talked about fascism, but it seems like we don't want to overreact or misspeak in any way. So what's your reaction to that, I guess?
Yeah. Well, the first thing to say is that, when we use the word Christian nationalism and when it's used in the social sciences and with political science, it has a very specific meaning.
Right.
It's not just a label that's thrown around. It's measured very precisely with specific survey items that are highly correlated together and tested to make sure that they actually mean, and they are very clear. And the literature has actually gotten clearer as the years have gone on. Like we're asking questions like, the U.S. should declare itself a Christian nation. If we move away from our Christian foundations, we're not going to have a country anymore.
Right.
Like they're not fuzzy questions. They are really questions about Christian dominion and control, and so that Christians have a place of kind of first-class citizens are only Christians. Everybody else is kind of down the list in some second-class way. So that's measurable, right? And in a very precise way. And the way I think about these two things, and the reason why we wanted to do a whole separate survey, really focusing on authoritarianism as a separate measure, and not conflate the two, is I think of these things as ends and means, right? So Christian nationalism is an end, right? It is about establishing a Christian nation where Christians have control of the laws and the government, and the country, right? That's Christian nationalism. It is about achieving an end. Now, what's interesting is that, I think for much of the U.S. history, Christian nationalism has actually been able to leverage the democracy to achieve that end, right? There have been enough votes out there and I should also say that this kind of dominionist Christian nationalism is by and large a white phenomenon, right? It is kind of most rampant inside of white churches that have seen themselves as those who are the kind of, again, first-class citizens, the entitled to be the kind of ruling class, in the country from way, way back, like I said, from before the founding of the Republic, like this sense that, this is a white Christian country and God has ordained it to be so. So that's the end. Now, when white Christians are in the majority, they can often use democratic means to achieve that end, right?
Yeah.
You could just outvote people in many ways. What's different today is that if you take all of white Christians together, just demographically speaking, so Protestant, Catholic, non-denominational, Orthodox, etc., white non-Hispanic Christians, they only comprise about 41% of the country. And so the reason why we're seeing these non-democratic, authoritarian, even neo-fascist ways of kind of operating is because the votes simply aren't there anymore to sort of just outvote everyone. And so there is this tendency, if you still believe you need to achieve this end of Christian domination in the country, and you don't have the numbers, well, then these illiberal, undemocratic, and neo-fascist mechanisms really kick in.
Right.
So, Robert, you kind of touched on this a minute ago, but I want to expand a little bit about something I found a little peculiar. You mentioned the child rearing authoritarianism scale.
It's a mouthful.
It is. And if I'm reading correctly, you said, according to the report, Republicans and a majority of Black Protestants score high on this. In addition, church attendance and less formal education are also linked to higher scores. So can you explain to us what the scale is for those who have never heard of it? I think I might have heard of this once or twice, but I'm not fully understanding what it is. And why is this important to examining Christian nationalism?
Well, that's actually the secondary scale that we emphasize in the report. The primary scale is the one I was talking about before. So I just want to kind of get our listeners clear on this. So we measured it in two different ways. And we did that because there's basically two long-standing ways of measuring authoritarianism in the academic literature. So we want to kind of do justice to both. So the ones we were talking about before is a more political measure. It's called the right-wing authoritarianism scale. That one's developed out of that study of kind of post-World War II authoritarian leaders, like Hitler, Nazi, fascists in Italy, kind of wrapping our heads around that. So that is one trajectory. There's another trajectory that kind of sought to kind of measure authoritarianism without using political measures, right? And so that one developed, and what it developed was around, well, let's maybe ask people about their parenting preferences. So that one's called the child rearing authoritarianism scale. And it would ask people when you think about your kids, and I'm going to give you two different traits, tell me which one you value more in raising your kids. And so they were things like, would you rather your kid demonstrate good manners or demonstrate more curiosity? Would you rather have them have respect for elders or be more independent? Would you rather be well-behaved or be more creative? So it's kind of rule following versus kind of carving your own path there. And that one, again, we found about, at the national level, there are very similar findings. It's about 4 in 10 who are actually a little higher than that on the child rearing scale that in the past. And then we found about 4 in 10 in this survey who score high on that scale as well. It operates a little bit differently under the hood. And the one place that you pointed to is that African-American Protestants score higher on the child rearing scale than they do on the right-wing authoritarianism scale. And I think it's really because this one is measuring, the reason why we use the other one is more to talk about political space. This one in many ways is also measuring social class, that we find people who, and for pretty, straightforward reasons, that if you are doing blue collar work, so I grew up working class, and my parents weren't encouraging me to be an artist, right? Or to take theater. My parents were encouraging me to get a STEM education and get a job or be a lawyer, or, it was like that kind of thing. And so it was about I think the kind of creativity stuff gets a little short shrift there. And so being able to kind of perform things well, obey your supervisor, that's how you get promoted, right? If you're working a factory job, you're not going to get promoted working assembly line work for your creativity, right? You're going to get promoted for being a hard worker, knowing what the rules are and kind of carrying them out. So that one does measure things a little bit differently. I think it's measuring a little more social class than it is political orientation, if that makes sense.
Now, Robbie, this was really interesting to me because, as a student of watching the religious right emerge, reemerge, I should say, probably back in the 1970s and 80s. What paralleled that rise was the rise of individuals like James Dobson and Bill Goddard. And it was almost setting a tone for authoritarianism in one's own home, that the father should be the supreme leader of the home.
Well, but after God, of course.
of course, yeah, slightly below God.
But that father was in many ways the manifestation of God.
Right, yeah.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, but just the rise of those two movements in particular, with the rise of religious right, you had this political arm with Weyrich and all of that, but then you also had this religious component of it, and even inside of that, a subset of the religious movement with Falwell and all of them, the moral majority. You had these other outliers that were laying the foundation within the family for authoritarianism to take shape.
Yeah, and particularly gendered, as we were saying. I mean, it was also very, very gendered. I mean, you could see it in like the roles that boys and girls were sort of thought to imagine, right? And the way that marriage was constructed, that certainly more on the obedience side for girls and women, right, than for men who are said to be the head of the household there. But yeah, absolutely. You see this sense of obedience. And I'm also thinking about like the way in which I think the kind of broken and kind of crippled way that white evangelicals responded to the killing of African Americans by police. Mm-hmm. Right. I always remember Franklin Graham's response, was, well, you just obey the police officer and all will be well. Right. I mean, that you comply, you obey. Right. Mm-hmm. And so those sense of, but like, it's completely blind to all the structural ways that black and white people are treated by police. But this sense of like, the authorities are there and you obey, and there's an order, a hierarchy. And I think that's part of the appeal of it, right, is that there's a way, that worldview, what's always struck me about that worldview is that it's hierarchical, right? There are men over women, white over black, adults over children, and everybody sort of has a divinely ordered place and is supposed to stay in that place, right? And it just so happens that white, straight men are at the top of that, that pyramid always. But it's a kind of divinely ordained order where you can't transgress, right? You're supposed to stay in the spot that, in that worldview, God created you to be in.
Yeah. Okay, so here's another finding from that report that I'm just going to be really honest with you, continues to scare the living daylights out of me. Now, we have been on this tour with Ann Nelson and others doing screenings of Bad Faith. And in that Bad Faith documentary, you're in it. Great job, by the way, in your guest appearance there. But one of the points that they make and you make in the report is the dangers of Seven Mountains theology. Now, when we talk to some of our friends in the political realm, they have no concept of what this is. And they think it's, it might as well be religious voodoo as far as they're concerned. But this is something that is real. People believe it. They want to instill it in culture. So, Robbie, for our listeners, remind us what Seven Mountains theology is and why it's so dangerous, particularly right now.
Right. Well, one of the things that's been, we all watched happen was that, during the Trump era, I mean, Trump basically, there was kind of a regime change in the Christian right when Trump came into power, and he kind of held at arm's length some of the more traditional folks that we had, like when you just mentioned James Dobson, and others from the kind of Christian right 1.0 or even 2.0. And all of a sudden he was surrounded by people like Paula White and these other kind of Pentecostal leaders that were not fixtures, in the kind of Christian right. They were kind of more on the fringe, but Trump has kind of brought them more to the center. The kind of bigger movements called the New Apostolic Reformation, people like Lance Wallnau, who actually last week, J.D. Vance was at his event, right? Kind of stumping at that event. And it is a much more militant, like, you thought Christian right kind of 1.0, right. Ralph Reed and the company were pretty militant already, taking over school boards and those kinds of plans, right, for Christian nationalist ends. But this one is even more so, and it is this idea, that Christians, it's really a dominionist, straight up dominionist movement, that Christians are to, again, exercise dominion over the country. And, these seven mountains are just a kind of metaphorical way of saying take over every area of society, right? The government, the media, the media entertainment industry, businesses, right? It's kind of, that's what the mountains are, these kind of different segments of society there. And I think the thing that gives it its kind of violent tendencies that I think really makes me worry about it is that it has this idea embedded in it that those things are currently under demonic control. Right, and they're literally like demons. Like taking the task of Christians is to dislodge those demons, right, and kind of take control of those spaces. And what it means in politics, though, is it means that your political opponents, if you were in that worldview, are literally demonic.
Yeah,
right. They're not just like fellow citizens that disagree with you, even strongly disagree with you, but they're literally in league with the devil. And I think that's what is so destructive to democracy about this, is that we're no longer really talking about people who we might just have heated arguments with and disagree with. But when you get it down to that level and you're kind of fighting a battle of good and evil, and your side is the side of God and the good, and the other side is the side of evil and the devil, it does open you up to very extreme solutions, right? Even violence becomes kind of justifiable. And we see that, we measured this, like we had a question in the survey, God wants Christians to take control of the seven mountains of society, which kind of asked it straight out. And we have about a quarter of the country, that says, yes to that question. But when we look at the authoritarian index, it's highly correlated with holding authoritarian views. It's highly correlated with holding Christian nationalist views. And, evangelicals and Republicans are much more likely than Democrats and other, Christians to believe these things. So when you hear Trump using any language like that, or his surrogates using language like that, they really are appealing to this broader, new apostolic Reformation movement. And it's not just dangerous. I mean, it's just like anti-democratic in its fundamental underpinnings.
So, Robbie, let's turn our attention to this year's election.
Oh, let's not.
Some of us happen to feel that there is a lot at stake.
You think?
Kind of trying to mentally prepare ourselves, and several essential issues to consider. From your perspective, what do you feel like the top three issues voters are concerned about in this election are? How does all of this overlap when considering political parties or theological leanings? And I don't know, maybe we could talk a little bit about Project 2025.
Sure. Just a light topic you want to talk about.
I mean, as we wrap things up today.
Well, a couple of things about the election. So, at this point in the race, what I just kind of hints and tips for everyone, right? One, the national polls do not matter for who is going to win the White House, right? So I think just kind of ignore the national polls. What really matters is the electoral college vote, right, for the presidency. And there it really is 6 and maybe 7 states that are going to matter. So it's Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, kind of up in the upper northwest. Down in the south, it is North Carolina and Georgia. And out in the west, it is Arizona and Nevada. Right? Outside of those states, the polls don't matter, at least for the presidency, right? And so far, what we see, the most reliable polls, is that it is too close to call across the board in the battleground states. And another little hint and tip, here that I just always want to make sure I say is that the media has done us a real disservice with headlines like Harris is up by 3 points in Michigan, Trump is down by, or Trump is up by 3 points in Arizona. Most of these polls are 1,000 people. That means if they're registered voters, they're probably 800 registered voters. And if they're narrowing it to likely voters, they're probably down to 700, right? The margin of error on a 700-person poll is likely about plus or minus 3 to 4 percentage points, right? So if the headlines are like somebody's up by 2, up by 3, no, they are not up by 2 or 3. It is a tie. Right, because it is inside the margin of error. Like my rule of thumb, if it's likely voters, Like I am not taking anything to mean somebody's up or down unless I see a spread of 7. If I see a spread of 7, I start feeling confident. Okay, then somebody's really up and really down. So far, we don't really see a spread of 7 anywhere, right? So it is just too close to call across all the states that matter, and I don't see that changing a lot. Over the next, what are we now, 36 days, 37 days. So we've got just over 30 days here. It's pretty locked in. The other thing to say is that we also do not, and here's a non-finding that I think really should be kind of a shocker, is that despite everything, indictments, all the kind of crass language, all the and here I will say, not just neo-fascist language, but we have to be clear here, Nazi language, and not Nazi-like language, but Nazi language.
Quoting them, yeah.
Poisoning the blood of the country, calling immigrants vermin. Like this is literally out of Mein Kampf. Like literally, you can quote it word for word from Mein Kampf. So it's not just like sort of like that. It is a direct quotation, right, of Nazi language, applying it to human beings in our country in 2024. Like that's what we're dealing with here. And despite all that, I've not seen neither our polling, Pew's polling, anyone who's got a large enough sample to look at kind of white evangelical Protestants. It still looks like 8 in 10 white evangelical Protestants are going to continue to support Donald Trump in this election. And it looks like about 6 in 10 white non-evangelical Protestants, the mainline Protestants, are going to support Trump, as they have. And it looks like about 6 in 10 white Catholics are going to support Trump in this election, as they have. So I see no movement whatsoever in the kind of overall religious landscape, despite, I think, this increasing authoritarianism, increasing like neo-fascist language, and just languages, that undermines, just to kind of speak theologically, like fundamentally undermines thinking about the image of God, right, and other human beings, right? And yet there really is no pullback. And that I find, I still find remarkable, even though I look at these numbers all the time.
Yeah.
But how do you, and like you said, and like you and Mitch were just saying, when a candidate is quoting Nazi language, is regurgitating that, or like you said, passages and topics from this Mein Kampf book, like, how do you convince people that they are truly telling you who they are, and they're truly planning to act in accordance in this way? Like, where can we make the difference, I guess, is what I'm saying. And saying, not about a particular person, but anyone who is spouting these ideals, who is telling you this is using this language. We've been here before. We know what happens. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that any of you have an answer. It's just a question for the universe.
The question is about, we've talked often on this show and through other platforms, Robbie, about, we get who Trump is. We just do. He has told us who he is. We've been listening to this for over a decade now. But it's those who continue to look at that and hear that message and say, I want more of that, or I support that. And so to me, we have to draw a conclusion about those individuals. Either they think that it's just extreme rhetoric and it's not going to come to fruition once he gains power, or that's what they want. And one of the most fascinating studies that I've done in the last 10 years has been, we all knew how horrible Adolf Hitler was, but I was always consumed with the idea, how did he gain power? How did he gain his support? Because Germany was a hotbed of progressive values and thoughts, and culture was thriving, but yet it succumbed to fascism. So are we at that point? We often talk about how delicate democracy is, and I think we all believe it's hanging in the balance. But I also want to believe in the resilience of democracy as well. So is it both, Robbie? Can we depend on the system? The system is trying to be manipulated right now by a group of individuals across the country. That's alarming. We see voter suppression taking place even within 60 days of the election, with rule changes and purges. So where are we in this with 4 weeks to go? Is this a battle for our democratic values and our way of life as we know it?
Well, look, I think one of the hard things is, I think, and this was true, I think, in, sort of 1930s Germany, right, is getting people to take seriously what they're seeing right in front of their eyes, right, and getting people to take seriously what they're hearing with their own ears. And people kind of shrugging it off and thinking, well, it's not going to affect me. It's, even if they're not buying in, right, just kind of like shrugging off like how bad, right, it seems like it might be. And then, what always happens is that the kind of masses, right, in Germany, I think, didn't realize until it was too late, right, till Hitler had control, right, of the powers of all the levers, right, of government. But the classic things we see are demonizing of a people group, right, and Trump is just substituted immigrants, right, for Jews. Although, I mean, at this event that Trump was at just the other week, said basically anti-Semitic things at an event that was about combating anti-Semitism, right? Told Jews it was going to be their fault if he lost the election, warned Jews that, the state of Israel would be eradicated from the map if he wasn't elected, which even under that, right, is the assumption that Jews are sort of divided allegiance. And that's an old anti-Semitic Trump, that they care more about Israel than they do about America, that's really what they're motivated by. Like, there's all that kind of, underneath here. But like we're seeing, I can only say it like, we try to measure it here, but like the threat of Christian nationalism, that is an anti-democratic movement, is real. There are two groups in the country among whom a majority support those ideals. They are self-identified Republicans today. A majority of self-identified Republicans today, score high on that adherent or sympathizer side of the Christian nationalism scale. And by the way, the Republican Party today is 70% white and Christian, right? So the parties have sorted themselves in a way that our current Republican Party is essentially a white Christian nationalist party with an authoritarian as its head, right, of its party and as its leading candidate right now. It's a really dangerous place for us to be. And that's not I don't have to be partisan to say that. Like, what we need a healthy Republican Party in this country.
Absolutely.
We really do. We need a healthy, conservative, political movement in the country. That's good for democracy. But a party that's wholly given itself over to an authoritarian leader who is, pandering for votes by saying he's going to restore power to white Christians in the country as one of his, and demonizing immigrants as his leading campaign strategy. That's not good for democracy.
Yeah. Well, Robert P. Jones, I don't know if you've made us feel any better or not, but you have educated us, my friend. It's always a joy to have you on the program. We appreciate all that PRRI is doing. It's just a wealth of information. Our listeners are always quoting you and the reports that come out of the organization, and your brilliant books as well. So thanks for all you do. But Robbie, before we let you go, we've got one last question to ask you, and Missy has the pleasure of asking it.
So, Robbie, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
All right, I am going to try to end with one good news thing that I think is in the data that we just talked about, but like it's flipping it around. So, all of that is like really worrisome, right? The things we've been talking about. But if you flip that kind of those findings around, what we find is that by a 2-to-1 margin, right? So we found that, like, let me back up. So 3 in 10 Americans, right, score either are Christian nationalism adherents or Christian nationalism sympathizers. 3 in 10. But what that means is that by a 2-to-1 margin, overwhelming numbers of Americans reject that view, right? So it's 2-to-1. People saying no, like, actually, we support religious pluralism. We support kind of racial diversity in the country. We support fair policies for immigrants, like, all of that stuff. It's a 2-to-1 country. and it's more like a 60-40. It bets a 60-40 country. It's not a 50-50 country on many of these issues that we're talking about, and our politics have distorted that in a way. So I think that's kind of a good word. And then the last little practical thing is we will have much more on this and closer to the election in a couple of weeks. At the Brookings Institution, PRI will be releasing its 15th annual American Values Survey. So again, that will be October 16th at the Brookings Institution.
Excellent. Well, again, Robbie, thank you so much for joining us. I kid. We all know it is a very, very important time in the life of our country as well as our faith. We want, as people of faith and as followers of Jesus, we want to make certain that the love of Jesus is amplified through our voices, and we need a democratic society to do that. And so we need to counter authoritarianism anytime we get it. And we appreciate you and PRRI doing just that. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you.
Well, we've had Robbie on the show before to talk about his book. This time we invited him to be a part of our conversation leading up to this year's election. And once again, Robbie does not disappoint.
Okay, he is yet another, probably towards the top of a very long list of guests that I do not feel intellectually qualified to carry on a conversation with.
Does that include your co-host?
Sure. I just won't say where you are on that list. But yes, I'm just trying my hardest to keep up and understand, because I know the research, the statistics portion of everything that he does is so in the weeds. And I am so thankful there are people out there who are brilliant enough, like Robbie, to do this work. I feel it's important. But yes, just so you know, I'm trying to keep up with myself. However, he said something in the beginning portion of our interview that I just started and made a fast and furious note, because he put words to something that you and I talk about quite often, something I think about quite often, was that Christian nationalism, when we were talking about that. And I'm going to use my words, folks, I'm not quoting him, but he was talking about Christian nationalism being able to leverage democracy for, a period of time, in essence, because they've had the votes, they've had the majority, which, of course, for our short history has really been cis, white, Christian men, landowning, you can go on. And I can remember, in my mind, I just feel like when you start to lose, when you're any group that starts to feel like you're losing that power, you're losing that majority, what do? You start to panic and find other ways to hang on to it. You're desperate. And how do you do that if you no longer have a majority, which, in our conversation, he tells us in America, there's a 2-to-1 ratio of people who reject Christian nationalism. Yeah. And when you start to see those shifts, if you were the person historically in charge, what do you do if you don't have the numbers? You change the game, you change the rules.
Right. And
I feel like that is what has been happening. I think it's what's been happening for quite some time.
I think you're exactly right. And I think this is an extremely important topic to kind of expand on. Because I want to quote one of our children who often said to us when we would say, the country is not acting like it should, or this is not who we are. And our youngest son would always remind us, this is exactly who we are. This is what the country was founded on. And I think that's exactly right. The reality is those who in power make the rules. And that begins in 1776. Because the majority of people in this country who lived in this country, who made a living in this country, who got by in this country, did not have a say. Only those in power had a say. And then all of a sudden, those who didn't have a say began to work the system and demand that they fulfill that dream that was given birth in 1776.
Okay, we get a voice as well.
You get a voice. So all of a sudden, they're welcome to the table. Well, those in power don't like it. So guess what? As you said, they change the rules and exclude those. That has been happening for over 200 years. And we are seeing it again right now. even in this election. I'm going to get to that here in a second. Now, let me hit pause on what we're talking about and pivot to something that is more germane to our world that we've often talked about. There's this incredible book by Sarah Diamond called Road to Dominionism. And Diamond makes an argument that what we have seen in the major conservative political party in this country, the Republican Party, is a product of what was a test case within the Southern Baptist Convention. And what happened in the Southern Baptist Convention is those who had power and who had a passion figured out the way in which they could take over the largest Protestant denomination in the world.
We've talked about this before. That sounds to people outside of our ecosystem like no big deal, but just for context, talk about the depth, the size of the Southern Baptist, the financial size of the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yeah. I mean, again, largest Protestant denomination in the world, with billions and billions of dollars in cash assets as well as hard assets with property literally around the globe. And so this was, a financial grab as well as a theological grab for power and influence. And so when it was orchestrated, they began to realize all they needed to do was win a presidential election that was democratic each and every year. But if they won it for a succession of years, then they could appoint their people to the boards of institutions and organizations across the Southern Baptist Convention. And eventually they would have enough votes to take all of those institutions over. And that's exactly what they did. Well, we're seeing that same blueprint play out in the Republican Party and now on a national level with the federal and state governments. They have figured out how to play the game. And the one thing that these fundamentalists like to do and retermed Christian nationalism like to do is they play the long game. And they figure out how to divide the country and how to suppress those they don't want participating in the system. When Paul Weyrich, who was the political genius behind the rise of the religious right and the moral majority back in the 1970s, he said it openly. We do not want everybody to vote in election because when everybody votes, we lose. We lose.
I remember hearing and I don't even remember specifically where I heard it. So I probably heard it over and over in subtle ways in many different places I was in growing up. The panic and the kind of the worry over the fact that we, and when I say we, that would be, European white Americans,
right,
we're not going to be the majority by 20, something, whatever year it was. I want to say it was in the 2020s, which, maybe, I don't know what the demographics are now, but I just remember that overarching fear of, oh no, what's going to happen? And I didn't know any different. So you kind of bought into that. And now I'm angry that that's what my community was sold as a bill of goods, because now I think of it so differently. I'm like, how wonderful to have different perspectives and how wonderful to make a bigger table and to hear from other people from different backgrounds and to have other voices at the table other than just one.
Yeah. And the perfect example of what I'm talking about that is alive and well today and really puts into play the razor-thin margin of the electorate for this potential presidential election is the Electoral College.
Yeah, that's something that's a can of worms we're going to have to open up in a couple of weeks.
But it's simply based upon prejudice and racism so that Southern states could have an equal voice, even though they didn't count all the people living in their states.
Well, they wanted to count them as long as it counted for votes.
Well, they want.
That's what I'm saying. It's like I've been reading on this, and I'm trying to formulate something a little better for the coming weeks. But it's like they wanted the count for population purposes,
right? Because if you look at the popular vote, especially in presidential elections, it's swayed one way for decades now, and it's not swaying back. And so the only way Christian nationalists have any advantage in the electorate is because of the Electoral College. And it's based upon one of the greatest lies and injustices that this country has ever been built upon, and that is slavery. And it's something that needs to be addressed. I don't know what the answer is. I will be the first to say that. But I know the current system is unjust as far as the way it has been built. So all of that to say, when I talk to Robbie, these are the kind of thoughts that come to my mind, hearing him and his analysis and the statistics that he brings to the table. All of this is my own interpretation of things. But he really gets me thinking when he starts spouting these statistics and the information from these studies.
Yes, it's way above my pay grade. so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Yeah. I'm trying to figure out what it all means, but it's very interesting to me to listen to him and kind of to see where the country's mindset is. And then, match that up with where the voting trends are.
Yeah. It gives us a lot of angst.
100%.
So,
hey, there's a statistic for you.
We need Kat to come around and soothe our soul a little.
I need Kat to come lay on me for a few hours.
That's right. So, well, it's always great to talk to Robbie, and appreciate all that he brings to this conversation. And we appreciate you tuning in this week. Until next week, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.